Alrighty, well, we're all set then to begin a 5-week journey through this topic of America, God, and country. There are different times and different places and perspectives. Depending on how we punctuate that, can make a difference, right? Punctuation, you guys remember punctuation? Yeah, okay. So if we do America, God, and country, exclamation point, right? Like America with an M-U-R, yeah, right? But I mean, or you just put a period there, it's just a statement. But if you put a question mark, which is what you might see on your papers, then there's a reason, there's a question being asked. And so the question being asked as we put this together is the concept of what it's like to live in the United States of America in 2021 as a Christian. And we could begin by asking the question, is it different than it used to be? So some of you have been a Christian in this great country for quite a while, no offense, but you've seen quite a few different decades and different things. You know, I've asked some individuals about, can you compare what we've seen recently to, like the 1960s, those that were able to see both of those? And I've gotten answers of, yeah, it's a lot the same, and I've had some say, yeah, it's quite a bit different. It's actually worse in some ways. And so the overarching idea then is, how then are we supposed to live as Christians in a increasingly secular society? When we say secular, what do we mean secular? Okay, worldly, without God. So it's a society that is defined as being without God or without. Now, tonight's lessons, you can't tell me what to do, is actually the attack on authority. And so maybe you could relate to stories such as this. The statement was uttered very boldly by a young individual. Try to make us. Remember the incident well. We were in junior high school at the time. It happened during recess, where some of us were playing around at basketball in the gym. We had not been playing long when the coach of the junior high basketball team blew his whistle and said, "Clear the floor. Team gets to practice now." There was no little resentment among us as we grudgingly yielded the floor to the privileged athletes. One of the disenfranchised non-jocks expressed his feelings by mumbling, "Try to make us." He really didn't intend for this for the coach's ears. He wasn't challenging, he was just grumbling. Unfortunately for him, he grumbled just loud enough for the coach to hear. The gym got very quiet as the coach slowly walked over to face the cringing boy. In a stern voice, he said, "Try to make us, you say. Well, listen here, young man. Don't think I can't make you. You do as I tell you. Now shape up and sit still." He did. He was very still indeed. See, that day, the boy we all learned a lesson in authority. Despite the widespread attitude to the contrary, it is a fact that there are others who have the right, that's your first blank, to tell us what to do and to make us do it. So, very key, important thought here is that there are others who have the right to tell us what to do and to make us do it. Now, for a lot of us, when we hear that word, they have the right to tell us what to do and to make us do it, what kind of visceral reaction do you have to that? It's like, oh, that's nice. Yeah, Randy said, put your dukes up, right? Them's fighting words. There's something about us, I believe, in our fallen state that bucks that rejects that concept. And it's that which we have to fight ourselves against, is ourselves wanting to not submit and reject authority ourselves. I think this is a battle every individual faces. But there are others that have a right to tell us what to do and to make us do it. In other words, there's such a thing as authority. Authority is exactly this. It is the right to tell others what they ought to do and the right to enforce the prescribed conduct through the use of power, such as the threat of punishment for contrary behavior. Now, this sentence right here, if I were to utter this in certain circles today, they'd be throwing rocks at me. The right to tell somebody what to do, that they ought to do it, you will do it, and if you don't, there'll be consequences. Is that concept this idea is one that's growing in popularity in our culture today? It's the exact opposite. We as a culture are being taught to reject all ideas of authority. In fact, we're supposed to rebel against authority. That's what's being taught. See, the important word here is right. A person has authority over me not just because he is bigger or smarter than I am, or because he has a gun in his hand, or because he is a forceful leader. See, authority is a spiritual quality, an intangible moral right, which a person possesses with no necessary connection to his other qualities. I'm going to read that one more time, and I really want you to think about it. Authority is a spiritual quality. Why do we say it's a spiritual quality? Okay, because when we talk about the idea is that it emanates from God. It is a spiritual quality. Might does not make right in any true sense. A bully or a man with a gun may have the power to make me do something, but that does not give him the right to do so. On the other hand, a person may have the right to prescribe and enforce conduct, but not have the power to do it. I remember a petite widowed mother of 3 strapping adolescent boys. Whenever the boys chose to defy their mother, there was no way she could make them obey. She was just not big enough. Does this mean that she had lost her authority as a parent? No. The authority to require obedience from her sons was still there, even the right to enforce it remained, though she did not have the physical strength to do so. Now, this is probably one of the most important statements in this entire lesson, and it is this. Authority and morality go hand in hand. Okay, so I know that Eric is considering, and I believe he's starting a series either throughout this year, if he's not already started it, on ethics, right? And so if we just sat for a moment and think about all the different ethical questions of life, all the different things that are ethically based, there's a whole lot of ethics, ethical subjects. I mean, we gravitate towards some of the great big subjects, but there's a lot of, just about every aspect of our life is touched by ethics and morality. So authority and morality go hand in hand. I would say that one is necessary for the other. Can you have morality, true morality, without authority? Okay, authority sets the boundaries. Okay, so the question, you can have morality. You're right, just hang with me here. I'm not saying you're wrong. You can't have morality without authority. Without a certain type of authority. Actually, it's morality is based on authority, whether we realize it or not. So let's break this down a little bit further. I would say there's such a thing as subjective authority and objective authority. What do I mean by subjective and objective? What's the distinction we're making there? Yeah, okay, so, yeah, you're on the right track. You just had them attached to different things. Okay, was somebody saying something over here too that wanted to subjective and objective? Did I hear? Okay, that is true. Yeah, so, yeah, that is kind of the essence of the etymology of the words there and that kind of thing. So think of it, and Doug was on the right track. You just kind of had him flipped a little bit. So what we witness, what we are witnessing a push for in our society is subjective morality. So when we say subjective morality, is that each individual gets to determine right and wrong. Okay, in that state of affairs, and with subjective morality, and you being the authority, then how can we as a society determine morality as a whole? Because you have to determine morality as a whole, don't you? What do we have in our society that is based on morality as a whole? Laws. Okay? So if we have laws, it's based on, so if everybody is their own authority in relationship to morality, then what determines ultimately what is right and what is wrong? Ultimately, in a grand sense. So not just for the individual, but for a society. Lawmakers, okay, so ultimately what determines it? Majority rule. Majority rule determines. Now what's fascinating is when the minority can rule in a backward way. And I don't mean that, I'm talking about minority of numbers, not like we would use the minority as far as races are concerned. So authority and morality go hand in hand. See, there is little need to seek the answers to ethical questions if one does not understand the nature of authority. Authority is the framework within ethical decisions or within which ethical decisions are made and moral conduct realized. Without authority, the whole concept of right and wrong is meaningless. And so what we're really saying here is this, is that for morality to be true morality, one that is universal, because morality should be universal, shouldn't it? Shouldn't it be according for all people in all circumstances? Should be. There has to be an objective source of morality. There has to be an objective source of ethics for it to be true. And if it's not, then it's simply determined by might or majority. See, in our society, we have determined that majority rule is the way we're going to do things, right? That's what we're going to give credence to. Other societies, it's not about that. It's about one individual who has the power. That, throughout time in different places, it's about the king. And the king can determine right and wrong. And if you have that, then when that's the case, how do things usually end up for the people? It's great, right? It's terrible if there's no objective source of morality. Now, if the king does have an objective source of morality, see, if we look through the Old Testament, we can kind of see that it depended upon whether or not the king responded to the objective source of morality or made himself the authority. Without authority, the whole concept of right and wrong is meaningless. So, to begin our study of this whole question, we need to talk about the rejection of authority. Now, how many of you like listening to Frank Sinatra? I mean, everybody likes a good Sinatra song, right? Well, I don't know which one you'd say is his most famous song, but I Did It My Way is a pretty famous song of his. It's probably his top 2 or 3 songs, wouldn't you say? Maybe New York, right? That, and maybe I Did It My Way. If you really listen to the feeling and the tone and the lyrics of that song, it's rooted in rebellion. It's rooted in some not so good concepts of this idea of being, I did it my way. See, one of the most pervasive and most tragic characteristics of modern times is anti-authoritarianism, or the rejection of authority in favor of autonomy. So this next section is going to be called the rejection of authority on your papers. So as Time magazine once said, authority, the spirit to do it my way, is the clearly identified villain of education nowadays. A famous woman athlete has confessed to having a homosexual affair. Many are rushing to her defense. She has, quote, the right to choose her own lifestyle. Now, this is a long time ago, but this is the same thing we're hearing today. Everybody has the right to his or her own sexual preferences. The pro-choice movement vehemently opposes all laws against abortion, which there aren't many anymore. A woman has the right to do whatever she wants with her own body, they say. Civil libertarians, do you see what in that argument there where the authority is placed? The authority is placed in the individual rather than some outside source. Civil libertarians defend pornography and oppose all censorship. A person has the right to read or watch whatever he wants to, they say. These examples are expressions of autonomy, which is the enemy of authority. This word comes from two Greek words, autos, meaning self, or nomos, meaning law. The idea that of self-rule or being a law to oneself. This idea of autonomy. A more common term is the word freedom. Now, this is where things can get a little uncomfortable. We talk about freedom. Are Christians truly free? Depends on the context of the question, doesn't it? In relationship to sin, are Christians free? Do the scriptures speak of that? Yeah. But are we free? Are we autonomous individuals as Christians? Do we have self-rule as Christians? We're not free. We're slaves to Christ. So, freedom is a good thing, but taken too far, it can be a bad thing. What does Judges 21:25 say? Anyone want to look that up for me? Some of you might know it already. Yeah, let's hear the whole thing. Someone has it. You looking it up? It's in the Old Testament. Judges 21:25, or does it 25:21? Did I have that goofed up? Is it chapter 21, the last chapter? Okay, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. What is at the heart of that statement? No king. See, we always focus on doing what was right in their own eyes, right? But it says in those days there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So there was no sense of authority. A humanistic philosopher named James Christian describes autonomy as being free to make one's own decisions about what is right and what is wrong. See, they describe autonomy as the ability and the right to choose what is right or wrong for you. Such decisions will differ from person to person since they are based on an individual's private perception of his personal needs and nature, which in turn based only on one's personal experience. When we get to talking about cultural Marxism and what's happening within that, you're going to hear this idea of a person's experience being the ultimate authority. That concept has been woven into cultural Marxism, and we don't realize how pernicious it is. You'll see when we get there. To Mr. Christian, this is highly superior to an authority relationship. When a person accepts someone else's, such as God's decision about right and wrong, to Mr. Christian, this is highly superior to an authority relationship where a person accepts someone else's, such as God's decision about right and wrong. So being able to determine their own way is better than accepting someone else's way. He makes the point in his book called Philosophy and Introduction to the Art of Wondering. This book is used by many colleges as a basic textbook, instilling the concept of autonomy into the minds of many youth. Such rebellion against authority pervades every aspect of modern culture. There is a book, it's a small book called the Humanist Manifesto 2. That means there was the Humanist Manifesto 1. So you have Humanist Manifesto 1 and 2. What is the Humanist Manifesto? Yeah. So it's basically their what's another word for manifesto? Kind of like their marching orders, what they're based upon, their creeds, their guidelines, their bylaws, about what it is. So you have the Humanist Manifesto 1 and 2 asserts that ethics is autonomous and situational. We've heard the idea of situational ethics, needing no theological sanction. The countercultural Yippie Manifesto said, we are all our own leaders. One of John Lennon's albums deals with kids in school. Lennon described its purpose thus: I'd like to incite people to break the framework, to be disobedient in school, to stick their tongues out, to keep insulting authority. See, for my studies, I didn't live through it, but if we look at the core of what was happening in the 60s, it was ultimately a rejection of authority. It was rejecting authority and authority figures. Those of you that had been through that, would you agree with that statement? Was it a rejection of authority? Sylvia Ashton Warner describes her experience in a progressive school where 5-year-olds were taught autonomy and the full equality of teachers and students. Did you just hear what I said? Full equality of teachers and students in relationship to authority. So you have a room full of 5- and 6-year-olds, right? And you tell them that they're in charge just as much as the teacher is. What's that going to look like? Yep. Students were not made to do anything. They were just politely asked or encouraged. The typical incident was as follows. Teacher, what about picking up your blocks? Henry, I don't want to, and I don't have to. Teacher, well, who else is going to pick them up? Henry, not me, you dum-dum. The Ohio Department of Education funded a study guide called Education in Human Sexuality to be used in Ohio high schools. It teaches total autonomy in the area of ethics. Quote, moral behavior is the behavior the individual feels is good. So it's moral if it feels good, and immoral behavior is behavior that the individual feels is bad. Sure. Okay. You mean should we as American taxpayers fund transgender studies in Pakistan?
I'm saying, is that a way of changing their authority because of how strict they are?
Okay. You mean that we're trying to help them away from their culture? Is it legit? No, it's messed up for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Yeah, no. There's a lot. Everything that we're talking about here is important. That's what's happening in society. So back to this quote here. It says, by definition, behavior you believe to be moral is moral, and behavior you believe to be immoral is immoral, as you personally define and use your own values. Every person has the right to his own concept of sexual morality. Now, this is going to be a very, I don't know if you want to say shocking statement. How many are you familiar with, this is uncomfortable to even talk about, but this is a very stark example of following this logic to its end. So was Jeffrey Dahmer correct and morally right because what he was doing felt good? Well, if you follow their logic out to the end, you have to say that what he did was morally right. You have to. You have to follow their logic, because the reason he did it is because it was sexually gratifying to him, which is very uncomfortable and it's crazy to think about, but that, if you know anything about that, that's what drove it. Absolutely, in that moment. So if we hold to this idea, then they should be able to say he can do what he wants. But it's so outside of the logical framework of logic itself that it self-contradicts, and it doesn't get very far to get to that point where you realize that. It is no wonder that a Cincinnati high school senior was quoted in the newspaper as saying, if we are going to have morals, let's have personal ones. People should make their own rules. To the modern mind, such absolute autonomy or freedom is a right to be demanded. Authority, law, obedience, and submission are evil concepts. It's the last one in that section. They are repressive and oppressive. We're going to hear that word about oppression a lot when it comes to our studies in cultural Marxism. Rousseau lamented, man is born free, yet we see him everywhere in chains. To break the chains of authority is a high priority goal for many today. So we have the rejection of authority. What about the recovery of authority? The recovery of authority. How should Christians respond to this anti-authoritarian trend? How should we respond to it? Is it that big a deal? What should be our stand on this anti-authoritarian trend? Okay. Speak up. Is it something that we should... Okay. Would you say that sometimes that we have discussions in here that might be interesting facts about something we're talking about, but not a mountain where you would march up, plant a flag, and put it down? Do we sometimes talk about those things, right? They're interesting and good. And it's even fun sometimes to learn some interesting facts about the things about our faith, or some interesting this, that, or the other. And there's other things that are hills we should climb, plant a flag, and defend to the end. I mean, in the Christian church, there's two that come up all the time that there's two hills that we're going to plant our flag on, and then there's some, this is the only subjects you ever hear talked about. What are those two? Those two hills we're going to defend to the death. Baptism and communion, right? Should we defend those things? Absolutely. Are there other hills? Yeah. Is this one of them? I believe it is. I believe it is. Absolutely. See, accepting this is accepting authority. The whole I hope you understand that. Being able to say what this book says you need to do is an authority discussion. Right. Right. But underneath that is the concept of authority. See, if I say you ought to listen to the words of this book and do what it says, if we don't have an understanding of authority in general and the importance of authority itself, that individual would say, I don't have to, I don't want to, you dum-dum. You're not going to make me. So when we're witnessing, that's when we're talking to other people, that's one of the primary things that we're trying to get people to do, is to understand what this book says you need to do. And it's rooted in the concept of authority. So how should we respond to anti-authoritarian trend? We must resist it. We must resist it with all the force we can muster. Above all, you just said marriage, right? As one of those hills that we're going to die. We can't die on that if there's not if there's not an authority that speaks about the nature of marriage in the first place. And so this concept is it's one of those concepts that courses and flows through all that we do. It's a framework. And if that framework is destroyed, then everything kind of falls to pieces. And that you see how successful Satan has been at attacking the framework of authority and what it's done to the church and the Bible and God as a whole. So above all else, we must be very careful that we ourselves are not seduced by the strong appeal of autonomy. Its satanic propaganda is everywhere, in the media and entertainment, in every aspect of culture. We must take care that we do not unconsciously begin to think in these terms, and we must help our children to perceive the dangers of this current attack on authority. But we must do more. Christians must take an active role in a strong effort to recover the validity of the concepts of authority and submission in the world today. See, authority implies something else that goes with it, and it's that concept. If someone's in authority, that means someone is in, right? Our world, our culture loves that word. Ooh, they hate it. We ourselves must clearly understand the necessity of certain structures of authority, and we must do our best to get this point across in the face of strong opposition. Why is the recovery authority so urgent? Because paradoxically, our freedom depends on it. Huh? How does recognizing authority preserve freedom? It's a great question. See, if everyone acted only from love and goodwill, it is conceivable that absolute autonomy in the area of morality would have no effects on society in general, right? If everybody just loved one another, right, and had goodwill towards one another, then everything would be okay. Now, is that not the approach of some of our politicians and law authorities? Is that ever going to work? It's not, because what are they failing to recognize? Well, yes, but in that situation, what are they failing to recognize about people?
Not everybody's going to agree.
Man, there's a lot of evil in this world. Yeah, the reality of evil and sin and its effects upon all mankind. Just ask yourself, and this is, we could talk about this. When you remove authority, do things get better? Anybody moving to Minnesota, Minneapolis right now? What do? They removed authority, and what went skyrocketing through the roof? Murder rate. Crime. And they're like, well, we didn't see that coming. Same thing happened in Portland, right? Let's remove the authority. What happens? Love and goodwill just flowed in like a tidal wave, right? No. Without authority, evil's going to reign. If everyone acted only from love and goodwill, it is conceivable that absolute autonomy in the area of morality would have no ill effects on society in general. But this is not the way things are. All men are sinners. And the hearts of sinners are usually filled with selfishness and greed and hatred. That's all of us. I'm sorry, but all of us fight these things. But the ones who don't have any kind of objective authority are the ones that say, well, I can do this and this and this, and these are terrible things, but it makes me feel good. And then we have a whole society of those that are greedy and selfish and hatred, and it's without an objective authority, it's terrible. If everyone were free to make his own rules and do anything he wanted, only the strongest and meanest would enjoy such freedom. I don't know how many of you have watched any kind of movie where the current power structure has been demolished. And in that vacuum, something's happening in that vacuum where, like in a post-apocalyptic society, right? What do all these movies, what's interesting is that the movie makers know what men's going to do in those situations. Is it always, they just have big campfires, everybody loves one another, and they just help each other out? Every single time, what is it? It's power. Who's going to gain power? And it's this group over that one, and it's chaos, right? That's the way those post-apocalyptic movies are always done. It's always a fight for power. The strongest and the meanest would enjoy such freedom as to declare what is right and what is wrong. The rest of us would live in fear and peril. We would not really be free at all. You see, authority paves the way for freedom. For instance, if speed maniacs were free to barrel down the highway at 120 miles per hour without restraint, they would endanger themselves as well as others. If industrialists were free to dispose of toxic and chemical waste in the air or in the nearest lake or stream without regulation or restraint, our health and lives would be threatened. If criminals were free to rob and extort without fear of punishment, the whole fabric of society would be torn asunder. What does not have to be a Christian to realize this? The folk philosopher Eric Hoffer has said, the average intellectual contrasts authority and freedom. I say that freedom is impossible without authority. The absence of authority is anarchy. And anarchy is a thousand-headed tyrant. What we witnessed this year in our streets and cities were anarchists that were pushing things, that were flaming the fires, literally, figuratively. Anarchy, the removal of authority, and raising up a thousand-headed tyrant in its place. The Christian is interested in the recovery of authority not just for pragmatic reasons, though. We are concerned to reestablish respect for authority mainly because it is right. The basic fact of our existence is that when we say the basic fact here of our existence, the most important thing about our existence, if you were to ask a Christian, what's the most important thing about your existence? A lot of them would say, I'm saved. The basic fundamental fact. But even before that, the basic fundamental fact of our existence is the fact that we are creatures of a Creator. Before we relate to Him as Savior, we relate to Him as Creator. Every human relates to God as Creator. Not all will relate to Him as Savior. The basic fact of our existence is that we are creatures living in a God-created world. God as Creator and Lord of all has absolute authority. We are His creatures. We, as His creatures, have an absolute obligation to submit to His authority. This is the only right thing to do. All desire for autonomy is evil as well as unnatural against our nature as creatures. God has not only made a world of creatures who must submit to Him, He has also established within the world a number of authority relationships wherein human beings must submit one to another. Since these relationships are a part of our God-ordained existence, it is right that we acknowledge them and learn to live under authority. See, this is where when we talk about God-ordained relationships of submission and authority in our society, in our culture, in our world, we don't define them, we discover them. You understand what I'm saying? We discover what God has ordained. We do not define them. See, what we do many times is we define the nature of relationships. We don't discover what God has prescribed. I would say this. The reason we have denominations is because we have defined the nature of things rather than discovering. God has prescribed exactly what He wants for His church, but we have, as the church as a whole over time has defined what the church is or should be, what it should be named, how it should be governed. We've not discovered it, we've defined it. There are reasons why Christians should be concerned with the recovery of authority. By this time we can see how to accomplish this goal. The reality and proper role of authority will be recovered only when we recover the concept of God as Creator and Lord of the universe. Do you see why an atheistic perspective is so damaging to the concept of authority? Because if you begin with, in the beginning, goo, I think Frank Turk uses the phrase from goo to you via the zoo. That's funny. Think about it, right? From that primordial soup to you via the zoo, right? Through all the changes. And so if that's all there is, then how can we define authority? If that's all there is, then how can you define authority? It's nothing other than might and power. So the fundamental thing that we can do is establish God as the Creator and Lord of the universe, and the concept of man as a creature of God. See, our relationship to God as His creatures is on par with our relationship to God as our Savior. The rejection of authority is rooted ultimately in the rejection of God. Thus, we must call upon the world to acknowledge the real existence of the God who has revealed Himself in biblical history and in the pages of the Bible. And we must insist on the truth of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Real authority, the moral right to teach others how to act, does not exist apart from God. And the fact that He has created everything from nothing is what gives Him this right. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it, for He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." Psalm 103 says, 100 verse 3, "Know that the Lord Himself is God. It is He who made us and not we ourselves." Proverbs 1:7, anybody know that one? The fear is the beginning of knowledge. The beginning of knowledge. I hate to ask this question, and I won't have to soon because we have a clock that's going to be hung back there that it's got the Roman numerals in two hands, so I may need some of your all's help to read it. Okay. What's it? Oh, we're not even close to being done. Okay. On your paper, the last three blanks you should have recovery of authority. You should have that whole section filled in by now, right? Okay, the last section is the relationships of authority, right? The relationships of authority. And then to understand this relationship, the Bible is indispensable. And then the concept of delegated authority. So I'll just talk a little bit about those things really quickly and then we'll wrap up. So the relationships of authority is understanding the basic relationship of authority is the one between us and God. We should submit ourselves to Him in all things. In the Christian era, this involves submitting to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. So when we talk about morality and ethics, then we would always appeal to God's Word and what Jesus has said in His Word. So when we make the good confession that Jesus is Lord, this means that we acknowledge him as our owner and ourselves as his slaves. We commit ourselves to accept his instructions about what's sin, about what is sin and what is righteousness. See, this is an important thing. Many times, as people, we try to define, well, that's sin and this isn't sin, right? Well, when we are submitting ourselves to Jesus, we are allowing him to define what sin is and what is righteousness. And we commit ourselves to walk in his way of righteousness as he defines it. Even in the church, we have people that are defining, well, that's not really sin. That was just then. That was just in their culture. If it was sin then, is it sin now? See, when we are trying to figure all this out, this makes the Bible indispensable. We can't understand the world as it really is, the nature of the relationships, the nature of delegation of authority, and we as creatures without the Bible. How we're supposed to live, what we're supposed to do, how do we know? The Bible. All Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. It speaks to us with divine authority. So these spheres of delegated authority that we talk about, that God has delegated authority to certain spheres. And the primary ones we're going to talk about are the family, the church, and the state. Family, the church, and the state. And primarily the state. This is how we're going to talk about. Now next week we're going to talk about the purpose of government. The purpose. Well, is that our next lesson? Yeah, the purpose of government. So what should government be? How do we relate to it? How do we participate in it as Christians? That's what we're going to talk about. All right, any questions or comments on the rejection of authority? I know for some of you this is review of things that we've talked about, especially at the family rally, and I appreciate you working through this with me again, but I know for some of you this is new as you didn't get to attend that. Great stuff that we're going to do, but this is all building towards week 4 and 5, which I feel are extremely important, and it's stuff that we've not covered at all. So just this is kind of laying the groundwork for that. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, questions?